Let's go to our special guest now. Frank Gaffney, the president for the Center for Security Policy, joins us. Frank, good morning.
Good morning, Raheem.
How are you doing?
Well, it's a target-rich environment, the way I think of it. So I tend to thrive on that. But unfortunately, it's hard on the country that there's so much going on, and so much of it really of a very troubling character. I particularly am thinking of this dossier business and the attacks on Donald Trump that have been relentlessly pursued. Interestingly enough, with the help, in some cases more than just help, the active participation of some people who have prominently featured in an actual case of Russian collusion at the highest levels of the United States government. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, Raheem. It's an extraordinary tale. It's worth exploring.
It really is. We've been over it a little bit this morning. I've read from, I think the Wall Street Journal perhaps has the best animated write-up about this. It's I mean, it really does read like a political thriller book. And it hasn't taken long for this to be turned back around on the Democrats. It looks now, what it looks like at this point in time, is that the DNC and the Hillary Clinton campaign both retained Fusion GPS, who in turn hired British intelligence officer, former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele, to work his contacts. Remember, he was a former intel officer in Moscow, to work his Russian contacts to put together this dossier to bring about an FBI investigation into the Trump campaign and then the Trump administration. And that, for me, when you have Jeff Flake standing up there yesterday talking about dangers to our democracy, and when you've had almost every television anchor under the sun, including ones that you wouldn't have expected it from, shrieking shrill shrieks over Russian collusion with the Trump campaign, it just seems to me we're not going to get that reaction to the true collusion that's been going on. Would you agree?
Well, it's certainly been so thus far. There now seems to be, at long last, a willingness on the part of congressional Republicans, amazingly, to conduct the kinds of investigations into this actual saga of collusion by Hillary Clinton, by Bill Clinton, apparently by the Democratic National Committee, and by the way, by people like Robert Mueller and James Comey and Andrew McCabe and Rod Rosenstein and Eric Holder. I mean, these are people who have been prominently featured either in condemning Donald Trump for the putative collusion of members of his campaign with the Russians, or are actively involved in the investigation thereof. And the trouble is, I don't see how one of these people, if they're not actually going to be subject to, criminal prosecution, and I say that advisedly, at the very least are now completely incapable of performing an independent and honest investigation into these so-called allegations against Donald Trump. But there's so much more to the story, Raheem. This is now being brooded about, excuse me, with considerable feeling by many of us. But let me just add one other piece to this. There's an organization that is now suddenly in the crosshairs. It is called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, better known as CFIUS, its acronym. It is an interagency group that has a critically important responsibility. Excuse me, I'm getting choked up here. That responsibility is to try to make sure that we are not selling off assets of this country that will have grievous national security implications. It's got a whole cast of cabinet officers as its members, including the Secretary of State, including the Secretary of the Treasury. It turns out that as this so-called Uranium One transaction was being considered by CFIUS for approval. This is, of course, the transfer of 20% of America's uranium stocks to the Russians. And the voting on that idea was going to be conducted by, among others, Hillary Clinton and Eric Holder, then the Attorney General of the United States. She was the Secretary of State, of course. Hillary Clinton was taking in, either personally or through her husband or through her foundation, $145 million from Russian interests associated with this transaction. And Eric Holder knew that. The Mueller team knew it. It's the FBI, McCabe, Comey, and others. And Rod Rosenstein. I mean, this is scandalous in the first order. They did nothing to prevent this transaction. It went through. The Clintons were enriched. We sold, I believe, national security assets in the form of this uranium to Russians. And CFIUS, get this, at the same time this was going down, a guy who was at the staff director, in effect, of this organization, a fellow by the name of Amin Mir, is a Pakistani expat with Sharia supremacist ties, both personal and familial, including to the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, you just got to ask yourself, as the Pakistanis are all over this saga with the Capitol Hill Democrats IT scandal, who is in charge of actually monitoring what's in the national security interests of the United States? Certainly not CFIUS, certainly not the Attorney General or the Secretary of State, or for that matter, President Obama himself during this critical period of time. So thank you for letting me ventilate a little bit about it, but it is appalling. High time we get investigations, and thank God for Breitbart for focusing attention on it as well.
Well, Frank, we're really grateful to you for walking us through that. It's just some quite extraordinary stuff. Let me ask you this: now these details have come out in the Washington Post, no less. I mean, you know, if this was a Breitbart exclusive or a Daily Caller exclusive or something, they would try and call it fake news. But this is in the Washington Post. This is their paper, right? Right. Now that these revelations have come out about the DNC and the Clinton campaign financing Christopher Steele. By the way, a foreign agent. Okay, let's be very clear about this. This is not somebody that works for the U.S. government, has ever worked for the U.S. government. Is not an American citizen. This is a foreign agent that they hired. Now, you could argue that hiring was indirect. They still hired him to work contacts in Moscow to put this dossier together. What do you think? What do you expect the process to be from here? Will there be sanctions on the DNC? Will there be a dropping of Mueller's FBI investigation? Will they pivot to investigating the DNC and the Clinton campaign? What will Hillary Clinton say? Do you believe that Republican lawmakers should frog march the load of them through Capitol Hill and put them on very, very public trial for this?
Well, trial maybe.
Sure, you know what I mean.
Beyond the responsibility of the Congress, of course, but
hearings.
Certainly
I believe you call them hearings.
All of them to investigation. Yes, hearings, public hearings, as well as investigations that I would believe, based on what we know so far, translate into criminal prosecution of at least some of these individuals. And at the bare minimum, they cannot, in good faith, proceed with their own investigations now underway, again, without evidence of actual collusion by the Trump campaign with the Russians. I mean, this is
Mueller,
the thing. It is high time that the Washington Post get around to covering this. I'm delighted that they are. Yeah. But let's be honest, Raheem, this saga would not have gotten the attention that it has finally were it not for the work that you guys at Breitbart and the Daily Caller and others have been doing on it. And it has to now go to the next step for sure on Capitol Hill.
Is Bob Mueller compromised now?
Absolutely. Indisputably. I mean, again, here's the charge. He knew that Hillary Clinton and her circle were involved in what can only be described as a pay-to-play scheme. And he did not bring that information forward at the time that the scheme was being essentially blessed by this organization, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. That's malfeasance, I believe. That is certainly incompatible with the kind of assignment and responsibilities he now has. Absolutely.
What sort of confidence are we supposed to have in the Federal Bureau of Investigation when they were duped into opening an investigation pre-election and indeed post-election by one 35-page dossier written by a foreign agent?
Look, there are lots of good people in the FBI, thank God. But the leadership has been, I believe, corrupt for some time. Jim Comey, for example, has been called by many a dirty cop. Bob Mueller has been shown now, I think, to be compromised. Andrew McCabe, for crying out loud, took money from Hillary Clinton's best friend, through his wife, of course, but $750,000 while he's investigating Hillary Clinton. I mean, you just can't make this stuff up. The people in the bowels of that bureau are poorly served, as is the country, by the kind of leadership. And it's high time that Donald Trump cleans the place out, I think. But here's another example, just quickly, Raheem, because it ties back into this Pakistani national at the heart of the CFIUS process, for example. As I mentioned, Imran Awan and his family were deeply tied to a number of these members of Congress through IT services. At the very time that the FBI is telling us that they're satisfied that, and this is Jim Comey, that they're satisfied that the Democratic National Committee's computer services were penetrated by the Russians. It turns out Imran Awan, who may have ties to Pakistani intelligence, by the way, had the passwords for Debbie Wasserman Schultz access to that system. It is, as I think it was Ron DeSantis pointed out, or maybe Jim Jordan the other day in an informal hearing that was held because the leadership would not allow it to take place, an informal hearing, he argued that there's much more evidence of Pakistan's intelligence service being involved in the compromise of Debbie Wasserman Schultz and the DNC and so on than there is of the Russians. And the FBI, under this corrupt leadership, claimed, without actually investigating this computer system itself, the servers of the DNC itself, they took the word of, get this, a Russian-tied company, that indeed it was Russian involvement, not somebody else's. So we've got so many strings to pull. We need rigorous congressional oversight. I pray the logjam is finally broken, that Paul Ryan will let that kind of work be done on the Hill, as it should have been long before now.
Well, no wonder the Fusion GPS guys pleaded the fifth. Just
Indeed.
Finally, we don't have much time, so I wonder if I can get even just one word or one line on this from you, Frank. Is it time that Jeff Sessions unrecused himself?
Well, I think there's plenty of things that he can do, including getting into the issues that we've just talked about now on Uranium One, for example, without unrecusing himself. Whether he can do that with respect to the rest of it, I just am not in a position to say. Yeah. But we need his leadership on certainly the evidence of Hillary Clinton's collusion and Bill Clinton's and the Clinton teams with the Russians on Uranium One and so much more. Skolkovo is a whole other story, which we'll have to come back to another day, I know. But this is ripe for criminal investigation, and we need it on the Hill and probably in the Justice Department as well.
We shall get into it the next time. Frank Gaffney, President for the Center for Security Policy, thank you so much for joining us here on Breitbart News Daily.
Thanks as always, Raheem.